There are surnames that appear in courthouse ledgers, in church membership rolls, in county deed books, in Quaker meeting minutes, and in the private correspondence of men and women who risked everything to move other human beings from bondage into freedom. These names are not famous. They are not the names you find in textbooks. They are the names of farmers, blacksmiths, school teachers, free black landowners, and itinerant preachers who built and sustained one of the most carefully concealed networks in American history. And for generations, the families who carried those names were told nothing. They were handed a surname and a silence, and the silence was the point, because when a family had helped dozens of people escape slavery, when their property lines and their root cellars and their barn lofts had been used as waypoints on a route that federal law called criminal, the safest thing they could do was stop talking. The safest inheritance they could pass to their children was not a story. It was a name, and that name is still there, in your DNA results, in your county historical archive, in the margin of a Quaker meeting record where someone wrote, in careful script, that the family of a certain surname had rendered assistance. The network these families built was not a legend. It was a logistics operation, and it left documentary traces exactly where any logistics operation leaves them, in the movement of goods, in the transfer of property, in the testimony of people who were caught and the records of people who never were. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the Underground Railroad actually was, structurally and demographically, matters here, because the mythology has almost completely replaced the record. The phrase itself does not appear in any documented form before the 1830s. The network it describes was not centralized, not mapped, and not uniform. It did not run on schedules. It did not have a headquarters. What it had was a loose and shifting collection of individuals and families in Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, New York, Michigan, and across the Upper South and the border states, who made a decision, sometimes once and sometimes repeatedly over decades, to provide food, shelter, transportation, or legal cover to people escaping enslavement. The surnames those families carried became, in certain communities, a form of coded credential. If you arrived at a farm in southwestern Ohio in 1849 and asked after a family by a specific name, and that family was who you needed them to be, you would be taken in. If they were not, you might be turned over to a slave catcher. The name was the first layer of verification. What the census records show, when you trace these families decade by decade, is a pattern that does not look like random settlement. It looks like a network. The same surnames appear in the same corridors, in counties that sit along river crossings, along old Quaker roads, along the routes that connected Lake Erie ports to the border counties of Pennsylvania and Ohio. That is not coincidence. That is geography shaped by purpose. The first surname on the record is Coffin. Levi Coffin was born in 1798 in Guilford County, North Carolina, to a Quaker family that had already been sheltering freedom seekers for at least one generation before he was old enough to understand what the people passing through their property were running from. When Coffin eventually settled in Newport, Indiana, which is now called Fountain City, he and his wife Catherine built a house whose specific architectural features, the deep cellar, the secondary exits, the location on a road that connected to the Whitewater River corridor, were not accidental. Between roughly 1826 and 1847, the Coffin household is documented as having assisted somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people. The number is disputed because the documentation was deliberately incomplete. Coffin himself described the operation in memoirs published after the Civil War, and those memoirs are careful to omit names and dates that could still, at the time of writing, have caused harm. What survives is the shape of the network, not its full personnel list. The Coffin surname today clusters with particular density in the Quaker-settled corridors of the Ohio Valley and the North Carolina Piedmont, because the families that carried it moved along the same routes they had used to move others. A family bearing the name Coffin in Wayne County, Indiana, or in Guilford County, North Carolina, is carrying a surname with a specific geographic weight, and the county deed books in those areas confirm exactly the kind of land transfer patterns that genealogists associate with Quaker community settlement. The surname Rankin appears in Ripley, Ohio, in the records of the First Presbyterian Church, and in the correspondence of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. John Rankin was a Presbyterian minister from Tennessee who settled on a hill above the Ohio River in 1822 and spent the next 40 years using his position on that hill, which was visible from the Kentucky shore, to receive people crossing the river. The Rankin House is documented in both abolitionist correspondence and in the accounts of freedom seekers who later testified before Congress. One of those testimonies, given by a woman named Eliza Harris, is believed to have contributed to the scene in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which a woman crosses the frozen Ohio River with her child. The Rankin family assisted an estimated 2,000 people. The surname today appears in concentrations along the Ohio River corridor and in the Presbyterian communities of western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, because the families that bore it did not scatter randomly. They moved along denominational and familial networks, and those networks left a genetic signature in the distribution of the name across those particular counties. The surname Still is a different kind of record entirely. William Still was a free black man in Philadelphia, the son of Levin Still, a formerly enslaved man who had purchased his own freedom and eventually his family's, and Charity, a woman who had escaped slavery in Maryland with 2 of her children and was forced to leave 2 others behind. William Still worked as a clerk for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society beginning in the 1840s and became the primary record keeper for the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, which was one of the most active nodes in the entire network. Still kept written records of every person who passed through the Philadelphia operation, including their names, the names they had used in slavery, the names of the people who had enslaved them, the routes they had taken, and the destinations they were headed toward. He kept these records at personal risk. When Philadelphia became less safe after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he buried the documents. After the war, he retrieved them and published them in 1872 as The Underground Railroad, a volume that remains one of the most detailed primary sources on the network's actual operation. The surname Still, in its Philadelphia concentration, tracks directly to the free black community networks of southern New Jersey and the Delaware Valley. The DNA of families carrying that name in those corridors today carries a history that the census, which often listed free black families without surnames or under surnames assigned by former enslavers, does not always reflect. The surname Tubman requires almost no introduction, but the genealogical record around it is more complicated than the biographical legend suggests. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross, the daughter of Rit Green and Ben Ross, both enslaved in Dorchester County, Maryland. She took the surname Tubman from her first husband, John Tubman, a free black man whom she married in 1844 and who refused to follow her north when she escaped 5 years later. The name she is remembered by is not the name of her family of origin and not the name of the man who enslaved her family. It is the name of a man who did not go with her, attached permanently to a woman who went back, repeatedly, to bring others. What the genealogical record shows, when you trace the Ross and Green lineages through the Dorchester County records, is a network of extended kin relationships that connected to other free black families in the Chesapeake region, and that provided the human infrastructure for Tubman's operations. The surname Tubman today is not common, but the surnames Ross and Green in the eastern shore counties of Maryland cluster in ways that track directly to the free black landowning communities that formed the logistical base of Tubman's work. Those communities exist today in Dorchester and Caroline counties as tightly knit neighborhoods, whose oral histories have preserved, in fragmentary form, what the census records cannot contain. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The surname Fairbank appears in the records of the Kentucky and Ohio courts in a way that most surnames in this history do not. Calvin Fairbank was a Methodist minister from New York who began assisting freedom seekers across the Ohio River in the 1840s and was arrested, tried, and imprisoned in Kentucky twice, serving a total of 17 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary for crimes that were, under federal law, felonies. The Fairbank case is notable because it produced court records, and court records are more durable than private correspondence. The trial transcripts name collaborators, describe methods, and identify routes. The surname Fairbank, in the Ohio Valley records, appears alongside the surnames of families who were never arrested and never named in any court document, because the network's security depended on exactly that asymmetry. Some families took the legal risk. Others provided what could not be traced. The untraceable families are the ones whose descendants are most likely to have no idea what their surname meant in 1845. The surname Beecher carries a weight in this history that extends beyond the abolitionist press. Henry Ward Beecher, the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, was the pastor of Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, New York, which became a documented waypoint for freedom seekers arriving in New York from the New Jersey corridor. Plymouth Church held what its congregation called slave auctions, which were theatrical fundraisers in which the church raised money to purchase the freedom of enslaved individuals brought before the congregation. These were documented events, reported in the New York press, and they produced legal records. The Beecher surname today traces through the New England Congregationalist communities that supplied the abolitionist movement with much of its institutional infrastructure, and the genetic clustering of families bearing that name in western New England and the Great Lakes corridor reflects the same denominational migration patterns that shaped the network itself. The surname Garrett appears in the Wilmington, Delaware records and in the correspondence of Frederick Douglass and William Still. Thomas Garrett was a Quaker hardware merchant who, by his own account, assisted approximately 2,700 people between 1822 and 1860. He was prosecuted under the Fugitive Slave Act in 1848, found guilty, and financially ruined by the court-ordered penalty. He stood in the courthouse after the verdict and told the judge that he would continue. The records of his prosecution are preserved in the Delaware State Archives and in the records of the Society of Friends. The surname Garrett in the Wilmington corridor today clusters with the Quaker communities of Chester County, Pennsylvania, and the Delaware Valley, because Garrett's network was built on denominational trust, and that trust moved families along predictable geographic paths. The surname Loguen appears in the records of Syracuse, New York, and in the proceedings of the Jerry Rescue of 1851, which was one of the most documented acts of open resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act in the antebellum period. Jermaine Wesley Logan was born enslaved in Tennessee, escaped north, and became a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Syracuse. When federal marshals arrested a man named William Henry in Syracuse under the Fugitive Slave Act in October of 1851, Logan led the crowd that took Henry from federal custody and sent him to Canada. The event was prosecuted as a federal crime, and the trial records name Logan and approximately 26 others. The surname Logan traces through the AME Zion communities of central New York and the Black church networks that provided the institutional backbone of the Northern Network. Those church records, where they survive in the denomination's archives in Washington, D.C., contain membership rolls that amount to a partial reconstruction of who was present, who was trusted, and who was given the kind of information that the network required its participants to hold. The surname Goodridge appears in the York County, Pennsylvania records and in the photographic archive of the York County History Center. William C. Goodridge was a free black entrepreneur in York who built a business empire that included a barbershop, a real estate portfolio, and a railroad freight business, and who used his access to railroad cars and his warehouses to move freedom seekers north. The Goodridge surname in York County today traces through the free black community networks of the Pennsylvania border counties, communities whose demographic history is largely absent from the standard genealogical sources because the census records for free black families in this period are incomplete in specific and traceable ways. Where the 1850 census lists a family by the surname Goodridge with no given names and no ages, the 1860 census may not list them at all. That absence is itself a record. Genealogists who have worked the York County free black community records consistently find that the census misses people the church records and the deed books confirm were present, and the gap between those two data sets is the shape of a community that had reasons to avoid official enumeration. The surname Douglass, in its connection to this history, operates differently from the others. Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery in Maryland in 1838, arrived in New York, and eventually settled in Rochester, New York, where he published the North Star, and later Frederick Douglass's paper, from a print shop that also served as a waypoint on the route to Canada. The surname he chose was not his birth name. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He took the surname Douglass from a character in a Walter Scott poem, on the suggestion of a man named Nathan Johnson who sheltered him in New Bedford, Massachusetts. After his escape, the name was chosen partly because it was common enough to provide cover, and partly because it carried a literary association that Douglass, who who was already thinking about his public identity, found useful. The genealogical complexity here is that many families bearing the surname Douglas in the African American communities of the northeastern states and the Great Lakes Corridor carry no direct biological connection to Frederick Douglass, but adopted the name in the decades after emancipation as a statement of affiliation. The surname became a form of political testimony, and the census records do not distinguish between biological inheritance and chosen identity. When a family's 1870 census entry shows the surname Douglas and no corresponding entry exists in any earlier record, that pattern is the census record of a name taken on, not inherited down. The surname Mahan appears in the records of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society and in the trial transcripts of Mechanicsburg, Ohio. In 1857, when a man named John Mahan was prosecuted under Kentucky law for assisting freedom seekers crossing the Ohio River. The Mahan case produced extensive documentation because it involved an interstate legal dispute over jurisdiction, and those records are preserved in the Ohio State Archive. The surname today clusters in the Presbyterian communities of southwestern Ohio, where the denominational network that supported the operation has left a genetic signature in the migration patterns of families who moved north along the same corridors their grandparents had used to move others. The surname Hun appears in the Kent County, Delaware, records alongside the surname Garrett. John Hun was a Quaker farmer who was prosecuted in the same 1848 case that financially destroyed Thomas Garrett. Hun's property was seized and sold to pay the court penalty. The Hun surname today appears in the Quaker communities of Delaware and southern New Jersey, in concentrations that reflect the denominational geography of the network, because the families that took the legal risk in this history were almost entirely connected by religious affiliation, and those affiliations determined where they settled, whom they married, and where their descendants eventually lived. The surname Hayden appears in the records of the Boston Vigilance Committee and in the correspondence of Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison. Lewis Hayden was born enslaved in Kentucky and escaped in 1844 with his wife and son. He settled in Boston, opened a clothing shop on Cambridge Street, and became one of the most active members of the Boston Vigilance Committee, which was the network node responsible for receiving freedom seekers arriving in Boston and either integrating them into the city's free black community or moving them further north to Canada. Hayden's house on Beacon Hill is documented as having sheltered at least 13 freedom seekers at one time, and Hayden himself stated that he kept kegs of gunpowder in the basement with fuses connected to the front door. The surname Hayden in the Boston corridor today traces through the African American communities of the South End and Beacon Hill, whose institutional history is partially preserved in the records of the African Meeting House and the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. The surname Fee appears in the records of Berea, Kentucky, which is a location that requires explanation because it sits south of the Ohio River. John G. Fee was a Kentucky-born Presbyterian minister who founded Berea College in 1855 as an explicitly interracial institution in a slave state. Fee was expelled from Kentucky by a pro-slavery mob in 1859 and spent the Civil War years in Ohio, but his network of contacts in the Kentucky mountain communities, families who shared his religious convictions, and whose geographic isolation had kept them partially outside the plantation economy, continued to operate. The surnames associated with Fee's network in the Kentucky Mountain Counties cluster in ways that DNA analysis of Appalachian family lines has consistently returned findings inconsistent with the claimed exclusively Scots-Irish ancestry of those communities. What the haplogroup data shows, in families carrying surnames from the Berea corridor, is a degree of African ancestry that the census records, which listed those families as white throughout the postbellum period, do not reflect. The mountain communities that sheltered freedom seekers sometimes sheltered them permanently, and when a family that had gone white in the 1870 census produced a DNA result 150 years later that returned 4 or 6 or 8% sub-Saharan African ancestry, the explanation is often not what the family assumed. It is the record of a bloodline that was absorbed into a community that had made a decision, and that decision left a mark in the genome that the census was never designed to see. The surname Ruggles appears in the New York Vigilance Committee records from the 1830s and 1840s. David Ruggles was a free black activist in New York City who operated a reading room, published anti-slavery literature, and coordinated the reception of freedom seekers arriving in New York by sea and by the overland route from Philadelphia. Ruggles was the man who received Frederick Douglass when Douglass arrived in New York in 1838, arranged for his marriage to Anna Murray, and directed him to New Bedford. The Ruggles surname in New York traces through the free black community networks of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, communities whose demographic history is recoverable through the records of the African Free School and the New York Manumission Society, but whose genealogical continuity has been disrupted by the specific patterns of urban displacement that affected Black New York through the 20th century. The surname Truth carries the same constructed quality as the surname Douglass. Sojourner Truth was born Isabella Baumfree, enslaved in Ulster County, New York. She took the name Sojourner Truth in 1843 after a religious experience, choosing it to reflect what she believed was her mission. She became a central figure in both the abolitionist and women's suffrage movements, and was documented as having assisted freedom seekers in her later years through her connections in the Battle Creek, Michigan community. The Baumfree name, in its Ulster County, New York context, traces through the Dutch patroon communities of the Hudson Valley, whose record of slaveholding has been systematically under-examined in the genealogical literature. What all 16 of these surnames share is not fame. Several of them are not famous at all outside the specialized literature of abolitionist history. What they share is a pattern of migration and community formation that was shaped, in ways both direct and indirect, by participation in the network. The Quaker families moved along Quaker networks. The Presbyterian families moved along Presbyterian corridors. The free black families moved along the routes of the African Methodist Episcopal and AME Zion denominations, and those denominational routes followed the same geographic logic as the network itself, because the network had been built on those denominations in the first place. The result is that a DNA result today, for a family carrying any of these surnames and clustering in the geographic corridors associated with the network, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, upstate New York, Michigan, the Delaware Valley, the Kentucky border counties, is not simply an ancestry result. It is a record of a decision made by someone 2 or 3 or 5 generations back. A decision that may have been dangerous, that was certainly deliberate, and that left a mark in the genome and in the surname distribution maps that no census taker ever recorded and no assimilation officer ever erased. The evidence the genome carries does not come with an explanation attached. A 3% result for a haplogroup associated with West African ancestry in a family that has identified as white for 6 generations does not automatically mean what a family might assume it means. It might mean an ancestor who passed. It might mean a freedom seeker who was sheltered and stayed. It might mean a child who was absorbed into a community that kept no record and asked no questions. The DNA does not specify, but the surname distribution maps, the denominational records, the Quaker meeting minutes, the Vigilance Committee correspondence, and the county deed books all read together, begin to draw a shape. And that shape is the shape of a network that was built by specific families with specific surnames, and that left a specific genetic mark in the communities it passed through. The generation that stopped talking knew exactly what they were doing. What they passed forward was not a story but a position, a place in a web of kin, congregation, and county that meant something to anyone who knew how to read it. The name they handed to their children was the only record they were willing to leave. It has lasted longer than they could have imagined. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that 16 surnames, drawn from communities as different as Quaker farmers in Delaware and free black entrepreneurs in York County, Pennsylvania, and Presbyterian ministers on the Kentucky border, all participated in the same logistics operation without ever meeting one another, without any central command, and without any written manual that anyone was ever foolish enough to leave behind. The network held because the people in it already trusted each other, for reasons that had nothing to do with the network. They shared a denomination, a county, a congregation, a language, a set of debts and obligations that predated their involvement by decades. The network ran on social infrastructure that was already in place. It did not create trust between strangers. It activated trust between people who were already bound. Consider what it means that the network left so little written instruction and so much physical evidence. The root cellars are still there in some of those Ohio farmhouses. The secondary staircases, the false walls, the windowless back rooms, they appear in property records as storage and in deedbook sketches as unmarked square footage. A county assessor in 1852 did not write, "This room conceals human beings in transit." He wrote dimensions. But the dimensions are there, in the county archive, and they match the descriptions that freedom seekers gave in their own testimonies. The ones Williams still recorded and buried and later retrieved. The physical record and the testimonial record line up. That alignment is not coincidence. It is the architecture of a logistics operation committed to paper in two different registers at two different times by two different sets of people. And when you lay the two records beside each other, the shape of what happened in those rooms becomes legible. The denominational archives hold more than most genealogists have yet pulled from them. The Society of Friends maintains records in four major repositories: Haverford College, Swarthmore, the New England Yearly Meeting Archive, and the Indiana Yearly Meeting Minutes held at Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, which sits less than 10 miles from the house Levi Coffin built. The minutes of monthly meetings document membership transfers, which is how a Quaker family's migration from Guilford County, North Carolina, to Wayne County, Indiana, can be traced across two state lines with the precision of a shipping manifest. When a family transferred their membership from one monthly meeting to another, the meeting recorded the date, the names, and the originating meeting. Those transfer records are the genealogical skeleton of the Quaker corridor, and they run along exactly the routes the network used. For the families carrying these 16 surnames today, the archive is still open. The Quaker meeting records at the Friends Historical Library in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, are indexed and available. The Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania are accessible. The Freedmen's Bureau records at the National Archives document the post-war lives of people who had been assisted north and who settled in the communities where the network had deposited them. The AME Zion Denominations Archives in Washington hold membership rolls that name families no census ever counted. The county deed books of Wayne County, Indiana, and Ripley County, Ohio, and Kent County, Delaware, contain land transfers whose dates and parties, read against the movement of the network, tell a story no single document was ever meant to contain. A surname, a corridor, a census anomaly, and a DNA result that does not match what the family was told. Those four things together are enough to begin. The bloodline survived because it was written into the genome itself, beyond the reach of the census taker, beyond the reach of the court record, beyond the reach of the family decision to simply stop speaking of what had been done and why it had mattered. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.